after I started looking at my presentation, I go, that's a lot of pictures of dirt here. and I'm going to veer off just briefly from what to do after the disturbance, because one of the reasons I started my company was I wanted to be different than other restoration companies and other ecological services companies, because most of the time they go in and fix the damage after it's occurred. What I wanted to do was work with private landowners and developers, oil and gas companies, whoever, to try to minimize the damage and plan ahead of time. So I'm just going to briefly touch on that, even though it's a little off of my topic. So planning is key to prevention. I can't stress that enough. If it's oil and gas related, pipeline related, or if it's future housing development and you're going to hang on to a share of it next door to you, you still need to have the legal documents to back you up, because the person that you started with is probably not going to be the person that you end up with, working with. Landmen change every other week. Developers hire and fire people. So you need to make sure you've got good surface use agreements, good legal documents. In the case of oil and gas, a good drilling plan, a central point of contact. Again, I can't stress this to you enough. This happened to me yesterday where we had a big blow up at one of our ranches, not like, you know, oil and gas blowout, but just a situation, and trying to get a hold of the right people because people had changed hands. It's real imperative to have a central point of contact and a current map of your area. If you have good base maps, it's going to help you with management decisions. And that's so much more readily available now that we have Google Earth, we have ARC, we have, you know, the USDA, NRCS offices, Parks and Wildlife, and people that can get you good maps. And, you know, don't be afraid to hire a qualified individual to help you evaluate things. So that's definitely a good idea. And then reevaluate your plan periodically, because families change and goals change. And before you do a site selection, whether it's oil and gas related or if it's, again, like I said, you're going to build a new lodge, you need to look at that site and see what the specifications are to it. And in this case, you want to go out and you want to look at it before the damage ever occurs. What is there? Because if you don't know what's there, then how are you going to know how to fix it? And so many of you are buying properties that were damaged greatly before you bought them. So you're kind of working backwards, so you're trying to go back and figure out historically what was there. But if you are in on the planning on the front end, then you can do that initial site evaluation. And you want to look, you want to take soil samples, because you want to know, and I'm talking detailed soil samples. You know, you want to know what your pH is, you want to know what your organic matter is, all of the nutrients and stuff that are in that soil, the texture, because that's going to help dictate what goes back there in the way of plant life. You want to document the current vegetation that's there, and it doesn't have to be anything more than photo points with some general information. You know, this particular property is 40% shrubs, 60% grassland, you know, or 50% grassland, 10% bare ground, something like that, and be able to say what succession it's in, and kind of a general rule of thumb, what is out there, you know, in species, you know, but it doesn't have to be super exact, you know, depending on who you are. And this one, I can't tell you, is so critical. Record your slope and your topography. So when they start doing construction, so often, especially in the oil and gas business, they have to have level surfaces. Facilities, pads, all that have to be level to meet OSHA standards. So they're going to change the topography greatly. So make sure that you document what it looked like before they started. And the same thing goes for if you're building a road on your property. You want to look at those slopes and those topography, because that's going to show you how water runs off your property, and it can either hinder the water movement or it can aggravate the way the water moves on your property. So those are things that you want to look at up front. Salvage any plants that you can. If you see that big trailer right there, those are some huge mesquite trees that we salvaged off of a pad site that we couldn't move. If we moved it, we would have lost really big oak trees. So we opted for salvaging the mesquite trees, and we're going to use the lumber for something. And then even things as simple as a strawberry cactus, you know, if you can, you know, pick them up ahead of time. I've seen this happen on other properties in the coastal area where they're moving housing developments into it. You know, if you've got native prairie out there, go out and harvest some of that seed. Go out there and get some of that sod if you can. And then with construction, make sure that you separate the soils. You know, get the topsoil separated from the subsoil. In pipeline and flow line right-of-ways, which everybody in Texas is having to deal with right now because you've got all this Eagle Ford shale production, and those pipelines are having to run through all of the Blackland Prairie area going to the coast. You're going to end up dealing with these pipelines and flow lines. You want to make sure that if they're putting multiple pipelines in the ground, that they're moving that topsoil out of the way. If they're putting a single pipeline in the ground, you want to make sure they're double ditching it to keep from mixing up your soils. And then again, if it's a pad location, like I said, like an oil and gas pad, a facilities pad, a lodge, a new house, save that topsoil. You know, take it and get it out of the way, out of the construction zone, and make sure, see, this is labeled. Y'all laugh. You have to label it because they'll go, oh, well, there's some dirt. We'll go over here and use it for this or that. And the next thing you know, and it happened to us on highway projects, we go down the road and go, well, where's the topsoil? Oh, well, they used it to build that overpass with, topsoil, because they were too lazy to go buy fill dirt or, you know, whatever the case is. So make sure that you have it marked. Now, I'm going to talk to y'all a little bit about oil and gas production because even where I grew up, in my part of the world, we have old production and stuff. And a lot of it is just, number one, it's dangerous. It's a big eyesore, and, you know, you really don't know what to do with it in a lot of cases. The first thing you want to do is you want to find out if you have a current lease, if that leaseholder is responsible for this production. And if not, if it's old production, then you have to trace who it belongs to. If there are signs out there, get the names off the signs. You can go into the Railroad Commission website, check and see who that belongs to. Then you've got to get those wells plugged before you can do anything with them, because you can't go out there and start cleaning up a site until the facilities are taken care of, because so often these old abandoned wells still have pressure on them. There's gas in the flow lines, there's oil in those lines, so if you start messing with this stuff, you could hurt yourself. So you don't want to do that. You want to make sure you know what you've got. You want to make sure that you hire a qualified person, you know, to take care of this. In a lot of cases, it's the leaseholder's responsibility that currently has your property. They're the ones that are responsible for that. So you want to plug all your non-producing or abandoned wells, and then you want to remove equipment. And this is probably one of my biggest pet peeves. What they do is they hire somebody that comes in and salvages this location, and they take all the good stuff, all the stuff that's worth anything. Okay? And so then they leave you with all this piping and all this other stuff. And so you have to stay on these people to say, no. You got the tank batteries, you got the pump jack, but you're going to come in and you're going to pick up all the piping and all the fencing and everything else. So it usually takes, I hate to say it, you usually got a lawyer up and get an attorney to write letters and stuff for you. And you would do the same thing if you had a couple of old homesteads that you wanted to clean up. You know, you're going to have to kill those gas lines or anything like that. And then you want to get that base up. Many of the old oil and gas locations, they use what we call caliche or gravel as a base. Gravel isn't as bad because it doesn't change the pH like caliche does. But you've got to get all that old base up off of that pad before you ever even start doing any restoration. You want to remove all that base, stockpile it, and then you can reuse it to fill in holes on your own road or whatever you want to do with it. Then you need to start looking at the site to see if you can tell if there are any spills. On this particular location, you can tell that that was a spill. Okay, it's pretty obvious. So then you've got to do testing. And do not try to do this testing yourself. Hire an ecological services company to do it, because you have to have a chain of command and a chain of custody if it's contaminated. So if it's contaminated and you go, wow, this is major bad, it's got arsenic, barium, all kinds of stuff I don't want my grandkids around, then you're going to have that information. And if you go out and collect the sample, you're just going to have to do it again, because you can't enter it into a court of law. So all that information has to be in a chain of command, and it's not that expensive to do when you start looking at it. So I'm not going to go into remediation. That could be a whole different topic. But if you know that you have a saltwater spill or a hydrocarbon, which is oil or gas or something like that, you're going to have to get that cleaned up before you ever start doing any restoration. In this picture, you can see some heavy equipment. The heavy equipment is what compacts the soil before they start putting base down. So the remaining soil is highly compacted from all of the equipment that they used to build the pad or the road, and then all of the drilling activity or facilities activity, or if it was an old house pad, it's going to be hard as a rock. So you've got to rip that soil in order to get water infiltration and air infiltration back into that soil. I'd like to tell you that, it's going to be a perfect world and it's all of a sudden it's going to spring up and plants, but it doesn't work that way. And you want to rip it multiple directions. So you want to rip it like east, west, and then north, south. You want to cross rip that particular location if you can. And then in this picture, you'll notice at the top slide, there is a berm in the background. Well, the oil pad's been picked up, but they built this berm because it drops off. Well, what they've done is they've totally changed the topography and the way the water flows on this location. So this particular location is going to have to be recontoured to fit back into the land. The slide in the far right, they built a pad, they built a road, and it changed the way the water moved. And so now we've got erosion off the pad and off of the road that's causing other problems on down the line. So all that type of stuff has got to be fixed. You've got to blend that stuff back into the topography. And then you want to purchase adapted native seed, and I'm sure that everybody's heard this talk all day today and yesterday, that's such a critical issue. I also do want to just mention briefly seed storage. You've got to make sure that wherever you're storing the seed, it is rodent-free, okay? I mean, I can't tell you how many people just take it and throw it in the barn, and rodents love this stuff. And it's like gold. So make sure you store it in a place that's rodent-free and out of the rain. And then you want to hire a competent professional to do the work for you, unless you have the equipment. But very few landowners have the expertise to do this type of planning. So locate somebody that has the correct equipment. I do not let my landowners broadcast seed. You can do it, but with the arid conditions that we have in Texas and the expense of the seed, your chances of it being successful are a lot lower. and then you run the risk of that seed being carried off by rodents and insects and birds. So I prefer to drill seed whenever possible. And you want to make it as clean a seed bed as you can. On the top left slide is a pipeline, and they did a really good job of cleaning it up. That was at one time brush, just like you see on the right side of the slide. The slide on the lower right is a ranch where they actually took out some brush, and they're trying to bring natives back in where they had exotic grasses. And so it's not quite as clean as seed beds. You can't use a typical grain drill to do something like that. You've got to use a no-till grass drill to do that. And then this one's so critical. You got to plant with favorable conditions. So often the contractors who are working for the developers or who are working for the oil and gas company, they have bid a job and they want to get in there and they want to get out. And it's the same thing with the highway right-of-ways too. You got to make sure that you're planting under favorable conditions, that you've got good soil moisture. Don't just plant into dry soil and hope for rain. It's not a good idea. I've had to do it. I don't like doing it. I would much prefer to plant into some soil moisture. Even if you don't have any at the very surface, you know, at least you've got some decent soil moisture, and with the anticipated rain, you can get it to come up. But if you don't have any deep soil moisture, wait a year. Save some money. Don't do it that year. And a lot of times I tell my clients I would rather them spend the money on a cover crop than I would them spend the money on the natives if it's going to be an iffy year. You know, it's much better to try rebuilding the soil than it is to spend money on really expensive native seed. And it's got to rain. It's got to have rain. That's actually here in Kingsville, believe it or not, off the roof of the A&M campus. And I mentioned that. Now, this is kind of a picture of what not to do. I don't know if you can tell the slope here, but this was a area of a ranch where it was dense brush, and the landowner wanted to open it up. Well, they went in and took the brush out, and then I hired somebody to do the planting. What they should have done was they should have planted on the contours. And when I got out there, I went, because what will happen is when it rains, the water's going to go straight down that hill and wash the seed out. This is really, really sandy soil on this particular ranch. So I'm hoping that with the moisture, and they had super, super good soil moisture when we planted this, that we've got enough forb development that won't be the case. But that's not what you want to do in that situation. And as I mentioned, you need good soil moisture. In this picture, you can tell, if you look at it, that's the tracks of the drill. And we started out with this particular ranch, and we had too fluffy a seed bed. And so if your seed bed is not firm, you're going to plant the seed too deep. And so we actually had to wait for a rain, get the seed bed firmed up a little bit before we planted. So I feel a lot more comfortable and confident that we're going to have a successful planting on this particular property. And unfortunately, we don't have enough research at this point in time to tell us what, what's the best way to do it. I've planted in litter, I've planted in stubble, I've planted in bare soil, and I really kind of like this planting down at the bottom of the slide where we planted in a native forb covering. Those native forbs were small, they were holding the soil, and both of these were on the same ranch, and the forb locations seemed to be holding moisture a little bit better. And so I think in that particular situation, that'll work out good. Now, if it would have been we were planting into really big, tall forbs or something like that, I think they would just, take the moisture from the grass seedling. And time will tell. We'll see what comes up. We'll be able to look at this in a couple of months. And I can't stress this one enough. Make sure that whatever contractor comes onto your property or the property you're managing, that they're bringing in clean equipment. So if they're getting ready to build a new lodge or a new oil pad facility, make sure that equipment's clean, because it's coming from some other ranch, some other property, and more than likely it's coming from a location that has exotic species. So it doesn't take that much effort to blow out the radiators and clean off the tracks and or the mulching heads, and get that equipment clean before you bring it onto your property. And that goes for your own property too. I see mow-decks all the time where a landowner mowed his property on one side of the place, and he had King Rancher Claybird Bluesim, and he went over to a pristine site and didn't bother to clean off the mow-deck, and voila, he transferred that exotic species. So that's a real important thing to do, and it doesn't take that much time. And you know, the introductions can come from all different kinds of equipment, and I won't bore you with all of that, but you know, like I said, anything with treads, big tires, tracks, make sure it's clean. And this is probably one of my pet peeves, and we've talked pretty extensively about it. There has been very little research done on how to rehabilitate mixed soils across the U.S., let alone in Texas. And as these pipelines come through your property, as you have, you know, old farmland, any kind of development, you end up with these mixed up soils where you've got elements on the surface that you really don't want on the surface and are unfavorable to get seedlings to establish. And for the most part, most people don't understand how complex soils are. And so that's why y'all are all getting to see a lot of pictures of bare ground today. And again, the school's still out on amendments, how much they help. I will caution you, first of all, do native grasses as a whole do not want nitrogen to establish. So don't use your typical NPK fertilizer to get your natives to come up. But building up the organic matter, the humates, you know, the sulfur products, any kind of micronutrients, you know, we don't have a lot of information to go on, but anytime you can do anything to encourage the microbial activity in your soil, you're going to have a higher probability of getting a decent restored site. This particular location was a very, very large frac pond. And the oil company planted it the first time, and all they asked me for was a seed recommendation. And so I gave it to them. Then I get a call from the landowner about a year later after we've had some decent rain, and said, there's just like nothing growing out there. And so I went out and took a look at it, and sure enough, very, very little. And the reason for that is they had gotten saline subsoils high in boron on the surface, and it was acting like a herbicide, and so nothing was coming up. And so we had to spend some money adding some humates and some micronutrients to the soil to try to build it up. Since we've done that project, we haven't had very much rain, so I haven't been over there to see how successful it was. But those are things that are so important wherever you can salvage topsoil, because the life of the soil is what helps exchange the nutrients between the plants. So those microorganisms, it's so important to try to rebuild those. And so soil amendments, if you have the budget to do it, might be a good way to approach things. And this is one that we're still, you know, looking at and working toward, you know, microbial inoculations, hooking them onto the seed. You can do that with legumes now by buying the rhizobia to go along with that. And I can show you some fabulous success stories where we've used hay, native hay. But the possibility of getting native hay in brushy areas of Central and South Texas are very slim. And then getting hay that's clean. So those are things that you need to think about. But on a small scale, on the right, that was a pipeline in a pristine Prairie location in Dimmitt County. It worked very well. So we had the labor, we had the hay, we made the oil company pay for the bales of hay and the labor. So it worked out in that case. And this is one of my favorite things to do, is use cover crops whenever you can. You know, use a cover crop that is, you know, for that particular season. Like this time of the year, for cover crops, we're planting wheat and cereal rye and Austrian winter peas and things like that. And in the spring, we'll do sesames and millets and maize and things like that. Many of you already know that TxDOT has had a tremendous problem with ryegrass, and there's a lot of research that's been done on ryegrass. So I would try to avoid ryegrass if possible, because it's going to inhibit your wildflower production. And I think that's it. As I said, there was a lot of talks about and discussions about dirt, and not much about the plant material, but I'm here and available for questions if anybody has any questions.
Up near where I live, there was a large basket fire. Highway Department did large reseeding along Highway 71. Appeared to have been very successful. Any idea of what they put in there or what seed they used?
No, but since you are a taxpayer, you can check with the TxDOT office, and they'll let you know.
Was that this spring that they put it out?
I'm sorry?
Was that this spring that they put it out?
Well, actually, they seeded it
Last fall?
pretty quickly after the original fire was extinguished, mainly because they were
worried about
But I know
erosion.
that they had 2 seedings, and the second seeding that they did this spring had some warm season natives like Salvage problem, but they also put like Bermuda grass and a few non-native species.
And the Highway Department is working to move more in the direction of natives, but because of EPA requirements, they have to have coverage on the right-of-ways. And so it's essentially against the law if they don't have the right coverage requirements. So sometimes they have to use non-natives because the natives aren't available.
Their special case was in some of the areas along there, the fire was so intense that it killed the old seed bed.
And that happened in West Texas. They're doing some fire maps for West Texas right now, and it actually changed the soil color where the fires got so hot, and it destroyed the seed bed in those particular locations. Happened in the northern part of Mexico too. Their fires were so intense that there are areas where the seed bed was destroyed. You know, there's a lot of times it's interesting to see that we're seeing if land just has the opportunity to rest, quite often the native seed bank will come in and take over again. But where you get these lower soil horizons up on the surface where root plowing has taken place, some type of construction that has put that soil on top, then there's often things that inhibit plants from establishing, and it'll be bare ground for a long time. It's the same thing with saline spills in the oil and gas industry. When you have a saline spill, saltwater disposal, water leaks out or whatever, those are very hard to reclaim. So there's something to think about. That has to take place first before hydrocarbons or anything like that can be dealt with.
experience with native seed success with hydromulch?
A little bit. I've done, I did some hydromulching on a tank dam years ago on one of the ranches that I worked for, and very dismal success with it. We've done some with, through South Texas Natives with TxDOT over the years, and some of the stuff closer to Houston has been more successful. We recently did a hydromulch project on one of the ranches that I work with, and it was fairly successful. So they're very expensive to do. If you've got small areas or a highly erodible site that you know you've got to get some cover on quickly, then they're probably worthwhile. But my overall take on it right now is we just don't have enough information, I think, at this point in time.
Any thoughts on what factors may have led to the Houston success?
Moisture. I mean, it's almost always in, reestablishing native vegetation. So often it's a rainfall, a timed rainfall event. And I've done, transplants. Transplants are a great way to introduce plants to a site. A couple weeks ago, South Texas Natives had a field day on a site that I had done some transplants on in 07, I think 07. And it's really interesting to see how those transplants, the wind has moved seed, and they're spreading. So, especially with things that are really hard to find and established by seed, running out there right before it rains or whatever and plopping some in the ground is a pretty decent way to do it. And that's what we did. We had a big rainstorm coming, and we put them in the ground and got a really high success. But it's so labor intensive. It's very, very labor intensive. Yes.
On any of these oil or frac sites, do they ever have in the surface contracts something about temporary irrigation to get the natives?
I have one client that does.
Okay.
I do,
And
we've done some.
People pay for that?
Yeah, and they are paying for it. So often during these droughty times like we have now, the water that we're going to be using, even Carrizo water, the higher levels of sodium and chloride in the water can work against you when it comes to establishing native grasses and stuff. So I usually would rather wait for rainfall, but yes, to answer your question, we occasionally do irrigation. It's just you're talking about a tremendous amount of people, labor, and there's just so much going on that there's usually not enough personnel to keep up with it. And so maybe you get it up, and then they pull that personnel off to go do something else, and then it never gets watered again. So I would rather wait till you had some rain and you know that seed's smart enough to know when to come up with a good, soaking rain as opposed to irrigating it in. But we've done some small plots with irrigation and they've worked good.
On the historic, production sites that you talked about at the first, is the cost of doing all that work typically borne by the current landowner? I guess if the historic oil company's gone or you don't have, I guess do the surface use agreements get handed down, or?
They do if the landowner changes their leases and stuff. They normally do, but the problem is with older leases, they have so few provisions in them. So if you're operating under an older lease, doubtful. The new leases, that's different. But one of the things a lot of my landowners do is when somebody wants their property and wants to lease it, they pick up all that liability when they sign that new lease. So a lot of times at that point in time, that oil company that's wanting to lease or signing a lease, they go in and they want to do some preliminary testing to see just how bad the sites are and what it's going to take to clean them up. And a lot of times if you don't have super contaminated soil, It's not that bad. They can make some money off the salvage of some of the pump jacks and the tank batteries, but just getting it all cleaned up. I've been working on one ranch with one oil company for 2 years now, and we are just getting to the point where we're finally able to look at seeding this spring. It just is a slow process. You know, you get them out there to do the initial cleanup, and then they can't come in and rip the soil or do anything like that until it's safe. You know, you got to make sure all the flow lines are capped or anything like that. So it just varies, and a lot of times you're going to have to check with the Railroad Commission or engage an oil and gas attorney to find out for you. Do a little bit of research. But the Railroad Commission's got a pretty decent website, so if you can get the numbers off of those producing wells and enter them, then you can find out who is operating it. Terry, you had
Well, going back to the frac tanks, frac ponds, and revegetation on those now huge berms. What have you seen? I mean, do you have to come back in and really modify that soil before you can really get any vegetation to grow?
We have. In a couple of cases, what we've done is where we knew that we were going to have a long-term facility, and we salvaged the topsoil off of something like that. We made them go back in and add topsoil to those locations to try to get some grass established on them. Now, a lot of the frac ponds that are being built aren't on drainage ways, or they're not ever going to catch water. And so I'm really, really picky about how they build those, because I want all that topsoil salvaged and I want it out of the way, and then I want them to build that frac pond in lifts so that when they go to collapse it in, the last soil out was the first soil that goes back in. And because a lot of those are going to be pushed in when they're finished with them. In fact, I had a long discussion by email with one of my clients in Dimmitt County yesterday about that very same thing. They have a frac pond that they're going to build, they're going to use it for 2 years, and then they're going to collapse it in. And he said, well, what's going to be our best route? And he's in some of that saline soil. So it's just so important. The last soil out gets first back in. And a lot of the oil companies are putting using some of that topsoil, you know, just to keep the erosion and the dust down right where they drive up. Well, then you're contaminating all that topsoil with caliche or road base. I don't suggest doing that. I would rather them build a road up to that location and keep your stockpile of topsoil out of the way, and then we can use it later on. Because and it's never the same contractor. It's going to be a different contractor that comes in and he goes, well, we did it this way on this ranch, and they forget, and then they collapse the whole side in, and then you just have this big mixing of soil. So it's so important wherever you can salvage topsoil to do it. And I would not suggest bringing topsoil in from other locations. Don't do that. It's a nightmare. You know, try to work within your own property if you possibly can. Thanks for y'all's time.
Thank you.
I'm not sure why I had the little
Magnifying glass?
Maybe it was actually on the screen somehow.
Yeah.